Welcome to History Explained, where we illuminate the past to better understand our present. I'm your guide to your daily journey through the past to empower the future. Today is Wednesday, June 4th, 2025. As we do every Wednesday, we're exploring a major global event that reshaped international relations and continues to influence world affairs today. Today, we turn our attention to the Tiananmen Square protests of 1989, a pivotal moment in modern Chinese history that captivated global attention and fundamentally altered China's relationship with the world. For 7 weeks in the spring of 1989, hundreds of thousands of Chinese students and citizens gathered in Beijing's Tiananmen Square to demand democratic reforms, press freedom, and an end to government corruption. What makes the Tiananmen Square protests particularly significant is how they represented the culmination of China's complex struggle between political liberalization and authoritarian control during a period of rapid economic reform. The events of 1989 not only shaped China's domestic trajectory but also influenced global perceptions of democracy, human rights, and the relationship between economic development and political freedom. So let's explore this transformative moment in world history, examining the social and political conditions that led to the protests, the dramatic events that unfolded in Tiananmen Square, the government's response, and the lasting impact of these events on China and the world. To understand the Tiananmen Square protests, we must first examine the broader context of China's transformation in the 1980s. Following the death of Mao Zedong in 1976 and the end of the Cultural Revolution, China embarked on a period of dramatic economic reforms under the leadership of Deng Xiaoping. Deng's economic liberalization policies, known as reform and opening up, introduced market mechanisms, allowed private enterprise, and opened China to foreign investment. These reforms produced remarkable economic growth and improved living standards for millions of Chinese citizens. However, they also created new social tensions and raised expectations about political reform. The economic changes of the 1980s exposed Chinese citizens to new ideas and experiences. Students could study abroad, foreign businesses established operations in China, and information from the outside world became more accessible. This exposure created a growing awareness of political systems in other countries and sparked discussions about democracy, human rights, and political participation. At the same time, economic reforms created new problems that frustrated many Chinese citizens. Inflation eroded purchasing power, corruption became widespread as officials exploited their positions for personal gain, and income inequality grew as some benefited more from reforms than others. These economic grievances provided additional motivation for political protests. The Chinese government's approach to reform was deliberately gradual and controlled. While embracing economic liberalization, the Communist Party maintained strict political control and showed little tolerance for challenges to its authority. This created tension between rising expectations for political participation and the reality of continued authoritarian rule. The immediate catalyst for the 1989 protests was the death of Hu Yaobang on April 15, 1989. Hu had served as General Secretary of the Communist Party from 1982 to 1987 and was widely regarded as a reformist leader who supported political liberalization and press freedom. His forced resignation in 1987, following student protests that the party blamed on his liberal policies, had made him a symbol of thwarted reform hopes. Hu's death provided Chinese citizens, particularly students, with an opportunity to express their frustrations with the pace of political reform and their desire for greater freedom. In Chinese political culture, major funerals often became occasions for political expression, as mourning for deceased leaders could serve as implicit criticism of current policies. Beginning on April 17, small groups of students gathered in Tiananmen Square to lay wreaths and express their grief for Hu Yaobang. These initial gatherings quickly grew as more students joined, drawn by the opportunity to publicly discuss political issues that were normally forbidden topics. The students' demands initially focused on rehabilitating Hu Yaobang's reputation and calling for press freedom, democratic reforms, and measures to combat corruption. However, as the movement grew, the demands became more specific and radical, including calls for direct dialogue with government leaders and fundamental changes to China's political system. Tiananmen Square itself held deep symbolic significance in Chinese politics and culture. Located in the heart of Beijing adjacent to the Forbidden City, the square had been the site of major political events throughout Chinese history, including the May 4th movement of 1919 and the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949. By gathering in this iconic location, the protesters were asserting their right to participate in China's political life. As April progressed into May, the protests expanded dramatically. Students from Beijing's numerous universities joined the movement, and the protests spread to other cities across China. The protesters employed various tactics to maintain momentum and attract attention, including hunger strikes, the creation of a student government structure, and appeals to international media coverage. The student movement demonstrated remarkable organization and discipline. Student leaders emerged who could articulate the movement's goals and coordinate activities across different universities and regions. They established communication networks, organized supplies, and maintained order within the protest areas despite the absence of official authority. Perhaps most importantly, the students succeeded in capturing global attention. International media coverage brought the protests to worldwide audiences, creating international pressure on the Chinese government and inspiring pro-democracy movements in other countries. The dramatic images of young Chinese citizens demanding democracy resonated with audiences around the world. The Chinese government's response to the protests was initially restrained but became increasingly harsh as the movement grew and persisted. Different factions within the party leadership disagreed about how to handle the situation, with some supporting dialogue with the protesters while others advocated for a forceful crackdown. Premier Li Peng and other hardliners within the government viewed the protests as a threat to Communist Party rule that required decisive action. They argued that allowing the protests to continue would encourage further challenges to party authority and potentially lead to political chaos. In contrast, Party General Secretary Zhao Ziyang and other moderate leaders favored a more conciliatory approach, believing that dialogue and limited concessions could address the protesters' concerns while maintaining party control. Zhao's public sympathy for the students, expressed during his visit to Tiananmen Square on May 19, ultimately cost him his political career. The internal party debate was resolved in favor of the hardliners, who convinced paramount leader Deng Xiaoping that decisive action was necessary to preserve Communist Party rule. This decision set the stage for the tragic events that would follow. On May 20, the government declared martial law in Beijing, effectively militarizing the response to the protests. However, the initial attempts to bring troops into the city were frustrated by massive civilian resistance, as Beijing residents blocked roads and surrounded military vehicles to prevent soldiers from reaching Tiananmen Square. The civilian resistance to martial law demonstrated the broad popular support for the student movement. Workers, intellectuals, ordinary citizens, and even some government officials expressed solidarity with the protesters and opposition to the use of force against peaceful demonstrators. This period of civilian resistance created a tense standoff between the government and protesters that lasted for nearly 2 weeks. International pressure mounted on the Chinese government to resolve the situation peacefully, with world leaders calling for restraint and dialogue. The crisis reached its climax on the night of June 4, 1989, when the Chinese military launched a decisive operation to clear Tiananmen Square and end the protests. Using overwhelming force, including tanks and armored personnel carriers, military units fought their way through civilian resistance to reach the square. The exact details of what happened during those crucial hours remain disputed and heavily censored in China. What is clear is that the military operation resulted in significant casualties, though the precise number of deaths remains unknown due to government secrecy and conflicting accounts from various sources. International media coverage of the crackdown, including the iconic image of a lone protester standing in front of a column of tanks, brought global condemnation of the Chinese government's actions. The images and reports of military force being used against peaceful protesters shocked international audiences and fundamentally altered perceptions of China's political system. The immediate aftermath of June 4 saw a comprehensive government crackdown on the pro-democracy movement. Thousands of protesters and supporters were arrested, student leaders fled the country or went into hiding, and the government launched a propaganda campaign to justify its actions and discredit the protest movement. The government characterized the protests as a political turmoil, instigated by a small number of political conspirators seeking to overthrow the socialist system. This official narrative became the only acceptable interpretation of events within China, and discussion of the protests was severely restricted. Internationally, the Tiananmen Square crackdown led to widespread condemnation and sanctions against China. Western governments imposed arms embargoes, restricted high-level diplomatic contacts, and suspended various forms of cooperation with China. The United States and European nations also provided asylum to Chinese dissidents who fled the country. The long-term consequences of the Tiananmen Square protests have been profound and lasting. Within China, the events of 1989 effectively ended hopes for political liberalization in the near term and established clear limits on acceptable political expression. The Communist Party's lesson from Tiananmen was that political control must be maintained at all costs, even if it required the use of force. However, the government also recognized that economic development and improved living standards were essential for maintaining legitimacy and social stability. This realization led to an accelerated focus on economic growth and market reforms, while political reform was postponed indefinitely. The Tiananmen generation of students and intellectuals who participated in or supported the protests faced lasting consequences. Many left China permanently, contributing to a significant brain drain as educated Chinese sought opportunities abroad. Those who remained often found their career prospects limited and lived under continued government surveillance. Internationally, Tiananmen Square became a symbol of the struggle for democracy and human rights in authoritarian societies. The courage of the Chinese protesters inspired pro-democracy movements around the world, particularly in Eastern Europe, where similar protests would help bring down communist governments later in 1989. The events also established human rights as a permanent issue in China's international relations. Despite China's remarkable economic growth over the subsequent decades, Western governments and international organizations have continued to raise concerns about political freedom, press liberty, and human rights in China. The Tiananmen Square protests occurred during a pivotal year in world history. 1989 saw the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of communist governments in Eastern Europe, and the beginning of the end of the Cold War. In this context, China's crackdown on pro-democracy protesters appeared to be swimming against the tide of history. However, China's subsequent economic success has complicated simple narratives about the relationship between democracy and development. While many expected that economic growth would inevitably lead to political liberalization in China, the Chinese government has demonstrated that authoritarian political systems can coexist with market economies and rapid development. This China model has influenced debates about governance and development around the world, particularly in developing countries seeking rapid economic growth. Some have argued that China's experience demonstrates the possibility of achieving prosperity without Western-style democracy, while others maintain that political freedom remains essential for long-term stability and human development. Today, more than 3 decades after the Tiananmen Square protests, their legacy continues to influence China's domestic politics and international relations. Within China, discussion of the events remains heavily censored, and new generations of Chinese citizens may have limited knowledge of what occurred in 1989. However, the fundamental issues that motivated the 1989 protests, desires for political participation, press freedom, government accountability, and individual rights, have not disappeared. They manifest in different forms and are managed through various government strategies, but they remain underlying tensions in Chinese society. Internationally, Tiananmen Square remains a powerful symbol and a point of reference in discussions about China's political system. Human rights organizations, democratic governments, and Chinese dissidents abroad continue to commemorate the anniversary of June 4th and call for political reform in China. The protests also highlighted the power of media and communications technology in modern political movements. The global television coverage of the events in Tiananmen Square demonstrated how domestic political movements could become international phenomena, influencing foreign policy and international relations. As we reflect on the Tiananmen Square protests of 1989, we can see how they represented both the aspirations and limitations of political change in the modern world. The courage of the protesters, particularly the students who risked everything for their beliefs, continues to inspire people fighting for democracy and human rights around the world. At the same time, the Chinese government's response demonstrated the lengths to which authoritarian regimes will go to maintain power and the challenges faced by peaceful democratic movements in non-democratic societies. The legacy of Tiananmen Square reminds us that the struggle for political freedom and human rights is ongoing and complex. While the immediate goals of the 1989 protesters were not achieved, their actions contributed to global conversations about democracy, governance, and human dignity that continue to this day. Thank you for joining us for this exploration of the Tiananmen Square protests of 1989. Tomorrow, We'll be back with our Cultural Insights episode, where we'll be examining the history and cultural significance of the Olympic Games, from their ancient Greek origins to their modern role as a global celebration of athletic achievement and international cooperation. If you enjoyed this journey through history, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode. We'd also love to hear your thoughts. What aspects of the Tiananmen Square protests do you find most significant, and how do you think these events continue to influence global discussions about democracy and human rights? Let us know in the comments section below. For our members, this Sunday we'll have a special roundup of world events from the past week with additional historical context and analysis, exploring how current global developments connect to the historical patterns we've been examining in this series. Until next time, I'm your guide for History Explained, where we believe that understanding yesterday is the key to navigating tomorrow.